Now, I remember when I was younger, maybe the kind of scenario and scene was that kind of perhaps you're on a school trip and you're on the coach and sitting in the kind of rows of three on the coach, and you're coming back from wherever you've been and you're having kind of random discussions with your friends. And I remember one of the discussions that we used to have when we were young is if you had to give up one of your senses, whether it was taste or smell or touch or hearing or sight, which sense would you least like to give up? Which sense would you least like to lose? In fact, we can have that discussion now. So take a few moments, seconds, to talk to the person next to you, murmur to someone near you. If you had to give up one of your senses, not including common sense, if you had to give up one of your senses, which sense would you least like to give up? Permission to talk and make a noise. Okay, so maybe for you, the sense that you would least like to give up would be losing the ability to taste. Imagine not being able to taste all the different flavors of your favorite meals or takeaways. Or maybe it will be losing the ability to smell. Imagine not being able to smell the aromas coming from the kitchen or the aromas of your favorite meals. And maybe for you, it will be losing the sense of touch. The loss of comfort and friendship that comes with touch, the danger in not being able to feel when things are really hot, and the damage that causes to your hands. And maybe for you it would be living in a world of physical silence, feeling cut off from society because you can't hear the conversations that are going on in the room around you. Or maybe for you it will be living in a world of total darkness. Losing your sight, not being able to see anything at all. I think for me personally, it would be the loss of sight. I would not want to give up sight if I had a choice. That would be the one that I would least like to lose. In a survey answering this question, 61% of people said if they had to give up one of their senses, that the sense that they would least like to give up would be their sight. Sight is such a wonderful gift from God, and it's something that we treasure and we want to protect and we maximize. That's why we wear glasses or contact lenses, or we have laser treatment. That's why people have cataract operations. We want to be able to see the best that we can. That's why when we go to the opticians and you're asked to read the letters on the chart in front of you that start off big and then work their way down and end up really tiny, we kind of turn it into a competition and a quiz, and we start making guesses, and we squint and we strain and we kind of lean forward, trying to convince the optician that we can see a lot better than actually we can. Those who lose their sight speak of how devastating it is, the sense, in some sense, of bereavement or loss. In reverse, I heard the story of two sisters who lived in rural India who were blind, Sonia and Anita, and who became able to see for the very first time. Just a simple surgical procedure that we might take for granted in the UK, but suddenly their world was flooded with colour and light, and suddenly they were able to see for the first time the people and the faces and the scenery that had always been around them. Now, back in Luke 9, as we've already had introduced, Jesus, he started out on his journey towards Jerusalem. And he set his face towards Jerusalem. That's the destination that is firmly fixed in his sights. And as he's traveling there through these chapters, he's meeting different people on the way. And from time to time, he takes his disciples to one side to teach them and to inform them about different things. And that's what's going on here in verses 31 to 34. He's on the way to Jerusalem, and Jesus, he takes his disciples to one side and referring to himself, describing himself as the Son of Man, he explains what's going to happen to the Son of Man to him when he gets to Jerusalem. The phrase Son of Man in verse 31 is an Old Testament title drawn mostly from the book of Daniel, and it's used of this divine king, but with human likeness, like the Son of Man. It's used of God's special chosen king. And it's a title that is the particular favorite of Jesus's to refer to himself. He is God's special chosen king. And it's with verse 31 in mind that we have our first heading, and the fulfillment of prophecies. The fulfillment of prophecies. Verse 31. And taking the 12, he said to them, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and everything that is written about the Son of Man by the prophets will be accomplished." Now, if you were to ask me why I believe that the Bible is God's word, that it's his book, and how do I know that it's authentic and genuine, one of the things that I would point out is the fulfillment and the accomplishment of the many prophecies in the Bible. The Bible is full of prophecies that were made hundreds of years in advance and that came perfectly true. Many of these prophecies, they're in the first half of the Bible, what we call the Old Testament, and they were made hundreds of years before Jesus, and for the most part they were about Jesus. They were prophecies made by people like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and David and Daniel and Micah and others, prophecies about who Jesus would be and what Jesus would do. So for example, it was prophesied in terms of the time frame of his life and death, when he would come and when he would die. So it was prophesied that he would come just before the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, which happened in AD 70. It was prophesied that he would be born in Bethlehem, born to a virgin, that he would have this godlike power and be able to heal the blind and the deaf and the paralyzed, that he would be God's special chosen king who would come to save his people. Just a tiny handful of the many prophecies made about Jesus in the Old Testament. And then what you have in the second part of the Bible, what we call the New Testament, is that we have recorded the fulfillment of these prophecies, how these prophecies came true. Now only God can know the future in advance. And so therefore that points us to the fact that the Bible is God's book. We can trust it. Maybe say, well, maybe these prophecies, they were made up by people after Jesus and made to fit in with the life of Jesus and claimed to be written before Jesus. But we know for a historical fact that that can't be true. One reason is because at the request of Ptolemy II, king of Egypt, who died in 247 BC, so long time before Jesus, his request, work began on translating these Old Testament scriptures and prophecies from their Hebrew and Aramaic languages into Greek. And so it's a historical fact that these prophecies were in existence long before Jesus came. You see, the Bible is God's word. It is his book. And what Jesus is saying here to his disciples is that in him going to Jerusalem, many of these special ancient prophecies made hundreds of years in the past, that they're going to be fulfilled. Everything written about him, it says, especially in terms of his work in saving people, is going to be accomplished. These prophecies, they're going to take place. And the import for the disciples is that you're going to see these things happen. You're going to be there. You're standing on the very edge of history. This is what the whole of the Old Testament has been standing on tiptoe for, looking into the distant future, waiting for these momentous events to come to pass, these prophecies being fulfilled. And I wonder, what the disciples, what did they think when Jesus told them these things. Maybe they just felt this sense of awe and wonder and excitement, that things that the prophets like David and Isaiah and Jeremiah and Micah and Daniel, things that these prophets from of old have prophesied, they're about to happen. And perhaps they felt a deep sense of privilege. They're going to have ringside seats. They're going to be there. They're going to be able to witness these things. I wonder what momentous events in history you can say that you witnessed somehow. Maybe you can say that you were a young child and you were part of the crowd that was lining the streets when Elizabeth was crowned as queen. And maybe you can remember watching that TV screen in July 1969 as you watched those footage and pictures of a person stepping onto the moon for the first time. And in some sense you can say, I was there, I saw it. At the quiz last night, I was in a student team, and we had the question of when England won the World Cup, which is 1966, if you don't know that. Well, it seemed in our group that no one really knew the answer apart from me, and the assumption from one of the students was that the reason why I knew that is because I was alive at the time. And we had quite a conversation about this. And I'm looking forward to when he comes back from Easter holiday. Maybe you can remember, or you saw on your TV screens, or maybe you were there when the Berlin Wall came crashing down, or those planes were flown into the Twin Towers. Jesus, he tells his disciples that these famous, awesome, ancient, sacred prophecies, that they're about to be fulfilled. That's what's going to happen when they get to Jerusalem, and they are going to be there. And I wonder whether they start to try and guess in their minds as to which prophecies Jesus was talking about. Well, they didn't have to wait very long to find out what Jesus explains is going to be fulfilled. Jesus explains it further in verses 32 and 33. So Jesus said in verse 31, "See, we're going up to Jerusalem, and everything that is written about the Son of Man by the prophets will be accomplished. For he will be delivered over to the Gentiles and will be mocked and shamefully treated and spat upon. And after flogging him, they will kill him. And on the third day, he will rise." And so our next heading, verses 32 to 34, is the cross is in view. On this Palm Sunday, as Jesus is about to ride into Jerusalem, the cross is in view. This is one of a number of times in Luke's gospel that Jesus has told his disciples that he's going to die, and this is the most detailed of his descriptions so far. So he explains that he's going to be handed over to the Gentiles. The Jews, of course, were under the rule of Rome. They had no authority to put people to death themselves, and so they were going to have to hand him over to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. He says that he's going to be mocked and shamefully treated. You think of Jesus at the high priest's courtyard, and he's been blindfolded, and he's being beaten, and he's being taunted. You think of him being taken before Herod, and a crown of thorns being pressed into his brow, and him being dressed in a purple robe, and soldiers mocking him, having their fill of fun at his expense. You think of Jesus hanging on a cross before all the watching crowds, all of his clothes taken away, shamefully treated, people laughing at him, shouting out, saying, "Save yourself." You saved others, save yourself. He explains he's going to be mocked and shamefully treated. He says he's going to be spat on. And the word spat there is actually a very graphic word. It means to be covered in the phlegm of others. And Jesus is saying when he goes to Jerusalem, when he gets there, he's going to be covered in the phlegm of other people. That's how much people are going to despise him. They're going to treat him as scum. He says he's going to be flogged. The disciples, it's likely, would have seen people being flogged and whipped before. And they would know that even just from the whipping, people could die. And they knew that the flogging was normally so bad that the wounds that were opened up were so deep that often you could see through the wounds to the internal organs. And Jesus explains to the disciples that's what's going to happen to him at Jerusalem. And then he says he's going to be killed. He's going to die a brutal, violent death. And then he's going to rise again. And he's going to be doing this to save his people. That's what him going to Jerusalem was all about. He's going to go to Jerusalem so that he can save his people. That's what's going to be happening. This is one of the biggest themes, if not the biggest theme in Luke. Have a look at chapter 19 and verse 10, perhaps the key verse in Luke. The Son of Man has come to seek and to save the lost. That's what Jesus is going to be doing in Jerusalem. And this is all going to happen in fulfillment of the Old Testament scriptures. So you remember the prophecy that was made in Isaiah 53, how Jesus, and this is 600 years beforehand, how Jesus is going to be led like a lamb to the slaughter. He's going to be this sacrificial lamb, and the Lord is going to lay on him the sins of all his people. You see, this is why he had to go to Jerusalem. That's why the cross had to be at Jerusalem. It's because it's where the temple was. The temple was where the Old Testament sacrifices took place. The Old Testament sacrifices were always pointing forward to the sacrificial lamb that Jesus would be. In fact, you remember in Isaiah 53 and verses 7 to 11, how it points forward to his trial and his death and his burial, and then alludes to his resurrection. He's going to have life after his death. So Jesus is explaining here to his disciples what's going to happen to him at Jerusalem, that he's going to suffer in fulfillment and in accomplishment of the Old Testament scriptures. And yet you find there in verse 34 that these disciples, they just couldn't see it. They couldn't see it. But they understood none of these things. This saying was hidden from them. And they did not grasp what was said. So what Jesus is talking about in terms of his suffering and how it would fulfill the Old Testament prophecies, it just did not make sense to them. Its meaning was hidden. It was concealed from them. They're in the dark. They can't see. This has happened before. So back in chapter 9 of verse 45, Jesus again had explained something, a small detail of what's going to happen to him, but the meaning was concealed from them. It was hidden from them. They were kept in the dark. It's likely that part of it is just because they could just couldn't envisage God's special chosen king, the Son of Man, suffering and dying like this. They just didn't get it. And they seem, in some respects, so blind to who Jesus is and what he would do and what the Old Testament prophets have meant. And I want to ask you this morning, can you see these things? Have you grasped these things? Do you know these things? Have you grasped the fact that Jesus is the sacrificial lamb that was prophesied about in the Old Testament? And as the sacrificial lamb, he had the sins of all of his people laid on him, and he took their place, and he bore their punishment and received what they deserve so that they can be forgiven and go free. Have you grasped that? Can you see that? And have you received it? Have you accepted it? And have you put your faith in Jesus as your sacrificial lamb? And then we come on to verses 35 to 43, and we find that the blind see. The blind see. So Jesus, with his disciples and the growing crowd of people that have joined them, are continuing on their journey to Jerusalem. And as Jesus and these people, they get near to Jericho, they go past a blind man who is sitting by the roadside begging. Mark tells us that this man is called Bartimaeus, which simply means son of Timaeus. And we don't know whether he'd always been blind, or perhaps he could see when he was younger, but for some reason he can't see now. Perhaps that is the situation. He once could see but can't see anymore. One woman who could see but lost her sight some years ago, she says this. She says, "Today I can see nothing at all. I dream in sight. My brain can remember what the world looks like. But when I wake up in the morning and open my eyes, there's nothing. Those little things everyone takes for granted make life impossible as a blind person. Pouring boiling water to make a cup of tea and buttering bread." She says, "The loss has been overwhelming. Every day I feel I'm grieving for my independence and the person I was before." So to be blind meant that Bartimaeus couldn't work. He couldn't work. Not being able to work meant that Bartimaeus couldn't earn any money. Unable to earn any money meant that he was reduced to begging. He was utterly dependent on others. He was on the bottom rung of the social ladder. He was the poorest of the poor. And he settled himself by the roadside near Jericho, begging from people. And on hearing this crowd of people coming past, he asks what's going on. And he's told in verse 37 that Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. And you notice what he does. He doesn't just nod his head and carry on as he was, just asking people for money. Nor does he call out to Jesus using the description that the people have given to him. So he cries out, verse 38, but instead of crying out Jesus of Nazareth, he cries out Jesus, Son of David. He said, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And those who were in front rebuked him, telling him to be silent, but he cried out all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Now, David was the greatest king of the Old Testament. And according to some of the Old Testament prophecies, some of the Old Testament prophets, for example, like Isaiah 9 and 2 Samuel 7, it had been said that God's special chosen king, the Messiah, would be a son, a descendant of David. You think of what the angel Gabriel says to Mary in Luke 1 before Jesus is born, how Jesus is going to sit on the throne of his father, David. He's going to be a son of David. And so when this blind man identifies Jesus as the son of David, he's clearly identifying him and aligning him with the Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah, God's chosen special king. And so in verses 31 to 34, what you have are 12 disciples who physically can see, but who in some way spiritually can't. And yet here in verses 35 to 43, what you have is a beggar who can't physically see, but who spiritually can see, and with a clarity that most other people can't. In some ways, he's a bit of a parallel to Zacchaeus in chapter 19 and verses 1 to 10. What was the problem with Zacchaeus? Be careful. Zacchaeus was short. Nothing wrong with that. However, when Jesus passed by, it meant that Zacchaeus couldn't see Jesus because people were in front of him blocking his view. In some ways, he's like this blind beggar. He can't see Jesus. And yet Zacchaeus spiritually can see Jesus in a way that most other people there couldn't. What was it that this blind beggar cried out for? Verse 38, he cried out for mercy. He cried out for mercy. You can tell that he sees Jesus far more clearly than the people around him because he understands that Jesus is merciful. Remember the disciples back in chapter 18 at the beginning of our reading. They didn't see that Jesus would welcome children. They just didn't see that. You see here with Zacchaeus that the people, they just didn't see that Jesus would want anything to do with this unkind, cruel, rich thief of a man. And they didn't think here that Jesus would want to even begin to be bothered by this man that society really doesn't want anything to do with. And so what they do is they tell this man to shut up. They rebuke him, they tell him to be silent. Jesus is not interested in you. Jesus won't want anything to do with you. And yet Bartimaeus, he cries out to Jesus even more. He understands who Jesus is. He sees Jesus more clearly than the people around him. He understands that Jesus' heart and character is mercy, and that he is this King of mercy. And he cries out again. And so Jesus, verse 40, he stops the procession and he gives the order for the blind man to be brought to him. And he asks the blind man what he wants him to do for him. What an opportunity. Imagine if Jesus said to you, what do you want me to do for you? What would your answer be? And what does this blind man ask for? Verse 41, he asked Jesus to give him his sight, to recover his sight. What faith that took. And yet this blind man, he understands something of who Jesus was. Perhaps Psalm 146 and verse 8 was one of this blind man's favorite verses. The Lord opens the eyes of the blind. Or maybe it was Isaiah 35 and verse 5, which says, and the build up to that verse, it says, it's talking about when the Lord is coming. When the Lord comes, then the eyes of the blind shall be opened. You see, the wonder of this encounter with this blind man is not just that Jesus opened his eyes in verses 42 and 43. It was that in the best of ways, this blind man could already see. He could see who Jesus was. He could see that Jesus was God's special chosen king that had been promised. He could see that Jesus was merciful. He could see that Jesus was who he needed above all else. And he had faith in Jesus. And Jesus, being the king who he is, he opens this blind man's eyes. And what does this once blind man who can now see, verse 43, what does he start to use his eyes for? He uses his eyes to fix them on Jesus and to follow him to Jerusalem. And Jesus seems to affirm here in verses 42 and 43 that this man's faith has brought more than physical healing. That this physical healing is really representative of what's already happened in his life, spiritual healing. And this once blind man, he glorifies God for what has just happened. And when the people see it, they praise God too. 4 points to finish off. Point number 1, you need to see Jesus. You need to see Jesus. Because it's possible to know lots about Jesus, to have been to church all of your life, to have read the Bible from cover to cover, to know all about the miracles and the parables and the teachings and the actions and the words of Jesus, to know all about the Old Testament prophecies about Jesus, and yet still not be able to see him. For these things to be hidden from you, for you to be in the dark. And this morning, if you're not trusting in Jesus Christ and in him alone as your personal Savior, if you've not put your confidence in him and in what he did at the cross, and if you're not depending on Jesus and Jesus alone for forgiveness and for eternal life, the reason is because you can't see him. It's because you're in the dark. It's because you can't see his relevance to you. It's because you can't see your need of him. It's because you can't see that you need him more than anything or anyone else. You need to see Jesus. Point number 2, you can see Jesus. You can see Jesus. It's ironic, isn't it, that Jesus' closest friends, the disciples, who were privileged to spend those 3 years with him, that they couldn't really see what Jesus was trying to tell them. They were in the dark in some respects. And yet here is this blind beggar who society doesn't really have much time for, who presumably has never spent any time with Jesus and has just heard bits and pieces about Jesus. he could see Jesus a lot more clearly than the disciples. And it's often the unexpecteds that Jesus reveals himself to. Whether it's the blind man here or Zacchaeus a bit later on. And so it doesn't matter who you are this morning, you can see Jesus. Whether you are a really young child, whether you've hardly ever been to church before in your life, whether you've been going to church for years and you're still not yet a Christian, whether you've lived a life that you are utterly ashamed of now, you can see Jesus. And you need to ask Jesus to reveal himself to you and show you your need of him. And to show you what he's done that you might be forgiven and made right with God. You can see Jesus. He will answer your prayer. Point number 3. However clearly you already see Jesus, you need to see him more clearly. So maybe you're a Christian this morning. However clearly you see Jesus, you need to see him more clearly. Now, that was the thing with the disciples, wasn't it, in verses 31 to 34. Though in many ways they were in the dark about what Jesus was trying to explain, it didn't mean that they couldn't see anything. It's just that the spiritual eyesight needed to improve. And they needed to understand more of what the Old Testament had said and more of who Jesus was. And the same is true for us. However clearly you see Jesus now, you need to see him more clearly. So if you ever kind of have the mindset that you know all that there is to know about Jesus, or you come to the Bible and you think, well, I know all this, you don't. You don't. However clearly you see Jesus now, you need to see him more clearly. You need to see more of his grace and his glory and his goodness. And Jesus is so pleased to answer that prayer for us to see him more clearly. And then point number 4, one day you will see him. And you'll see him face to face. One day you will physically see Jesus. So at the moment you see him by faith. And often our faith is clouded by different things and our vision of Jesus is not clear. It describes it in 1 Corinthians 13 as kind of wearing glasses that are a bit blurry and dirty, and we can't see Jesus as we would like to. And yet one day when Jesus comes again, all that clouds our vision now is going to be taken away, and we will see Jesus as he is. And among the many things that will happen is for those who are trusting in Jesus and who spiritually can see, but who physically can't see, their physical eyesight is going to be recovered and restored. And for the very first time, each one of us will use our physical eyes for the very reason they were given to us. You realize you haven't used your physical eyes for the very reason they were given to you. To see Jesus, to see him in all of his glory and his majesty and his splendor, to see him face to face. And we are always to be looking forward to and longing for that day. And so whoever you are this morning, turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full into his wonderful face, and the things of this earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace.